And let's bring in Donna Edwards. You just heard that appeal from the mayor, and the elections commissioners are speaking. We'll bring you any details that are pertinent to the vote count. Former Democratic Congresswoman and contributing columnist to Washington Post, Donna Edwards, and Kevin Madden, former senior advisor to Mitt Romney. Thanks very much for being with us. First of all, to you, your reaction, Donna Edwards, the House, there were losses in the House seats. Nancy Pelosi saying she will retain the Speaker's gavel, but there's a lot of criticism. There's a lot of internal fighting. Some of the centrists, Lisa Slotkin, AOC, Abigail Spanberger, have different conclusions for why some of those incumbents lost their seats.
Well, look, I think as Nancy Pelosi says, I mean, the Democratic Party and the Democratic caucus is really a wide range. It's a very diverse caucus, and so I'm not surprised by that. I do think that there is a natural tension between, those who are run in the strongest Trump districts and others, people like myself, who had a solid blue district. At the same time, we have to understand that in order to form the majority, it's going to take all of them. And I think that united behind a President Biden, that people are going to come together on an agenda for the American people. And these differences that we like to talk about in the press and write about, really within the caucus, I think those things will be worked out. I've seen Nancy Pelosi operate like in a caucus like that before, and I think that she's the right person to be leading the caucus in this really important environment.
And Kevin Madden, I wanted to bring to your attention Mitt Romney's statement, because a number of Republicans, Lindsey Graham, for instance, have been backing the president in his charges now, certainly after fierce attacks against Republicans who don't fight fiercely for the president by the president's sons and others in his orbit. But now you've got Mitt Romney, with whom you work with, of course, saying that the president is, of course, within his rights to request recounts, to call for investigation of alleged voting irregularities where evidence exists, and to exhaust legal remedies. Doing those things is consistent with our election process. He is wrong to say that the election was rigged, corrupt, and stolen. Doing so damages the cause of freedom here and around the world, weakens the institutions that lie at the foundation of the republic, and recklessly inflames destructive and dangerous passions. That's the strongest statement yet from any member of the Senate.
Right. But look, I think there is still a split within the Republican Party on how to react to the president's remarks last night. I think, and I think clearly the folks who are supportive of the president and believe that we need to fight that they need to fight this to the bitter end, they clearly outnumber those that are more from the traditional wing, like Mitt Romney, who believe that the process has to play out. So I think that tension right now inside the party, I think clearly the Mitt Romneys of the party are outnumbered. But I think you'll also see, as the process starts to play out, more from that traditional wing start to come out. We did see Senator Toomey from Pennsylvania today make very similar remarks to what Mitt Romney said about letting the process playing out and his belief that there is not widespread fraud. And if there is, it is incumbent upon the president, his team, and Republicans to bring together evidence of that. And so far, we haven't seen much of that.
And Toomey, of course, being from Pennsylvania, and was being asked precisely by Savannah Guthrie about, the allegations against Pennsylvania, which seems to be what the president is focusing on, largely because Pennsylvania is a deal breaker for him. That's, checkmate. If Joe Biden wins Pennsylvania, he knows that no matter how many of these other states. And we now have just been told we're expecting a Philadelphia update later this afternoon. We don't know how conclusive it will be, but there will be another update. I want to also ask you about Kevin McCarthy, the House leader who did not win the majority, but certainly picked up some seats. And this was what he had to say earlier today, or yesterday.
President Trump won this election, so everyone who's listening, do not be quiet. Do not be silent about this. We cannot allow this to happen before our very eyes. We unite together.
Well, he is certainly singing to the president's songbook.
Yeah, I think that view by Kevin McCarthy and others that have very strong voices and platforms inside the Republican Party, Newt Gingrich, for example, as well. I think it's emblematic of the current worldview that they have right now on this on the voting process. On this current voting process, as we see the mail votes being counted in places like Pennsylvania. And I think the big risk for the party is that as this process starts to play out, and clearly the vote totals don't change, and we do see a move towards certification of the election results, is the question is, how long will that last past certification? Do we see these tensions and animated forces within inside the Republican Party continue to voice comments like that as we get closer to January 20th, 2021? That is a real pressure point right now inside the party, and it's something that we have to watch very closely.
And similarly, Donna, there's certainly pressure points and schisms within the Democratic caucus.
Well, I mean, I think within the House caucus, clearly, Andrea, there are differences, but I actually think that the party has been amazingly united behind Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I think that that will continue as Joe Biden moves into the White House. I think that Joe Biden has run on one of the most progressive agendas of any president that we've ever seen. And I think that you're going to see a strong Democratic majority in the House lining up behind that agenda to make sure that it gets through. And I think that for those of us who just want to finish this election, it's important to go through the process, even to go through the healing process that Republicans are going to have to do, accept the decision of the American people, and then move on to governance. And that would be the responsible thing for Kevin McCarthy to do as leader. And we need to get to that point because Americans really deserve us all on a united page. I think Joe Biden is going to do that. And I look forward to putting this to an end, but let the process play out, finish counting the votes, get them certified, and then let's get to January.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.